Hi, folks. Tuesday evening again, and another live stream. Nice to see you on. Pre-show's on just for a moment or two as we come up towards 8 p.m. Hope everybody is well. And yeah, going to be an interesting conversation this evening about all things property related and a special guest. And here's a bit of a clue. Robbie Barwick, he's going to come in and just talk briefly about a very important thing that's just happened. So watch that space. In terms of doggies, we have one dog. Luna is there. Meteor has decided to go and hide under the piano. So she's not in the shot at the moment. She may come back later. We'll see. But that's the story. And I think everything else is working. Very important conversation this evening. I think people are beginning to wake up to just how serious the consequences for households are with regard to housing affordability and all those things. And we're going to spend some time on that. Anyway, we've hit the watershed. So let me take the pre-show off. I'll start the show. I'll be back in just a moment. Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 18th of August. And yes, Meteor has decided to bark just at the crucial moment. The bins are being collected, so apologies for dogs off. Can't do much about that. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on this evening. Thanks for taking time out of your Tuesday evening. And this is going to be an important conversation, some of my latest research, and I've also got a special guest, which I'll bring in just a moment. Just before I get going, though, let me remind you that we don't provide specific financial, property, or legal advice. This is a general conversation. We moderate the chat, but do feel free to throw questions, comments in. In fact, the more questions, the better. I use that Walk the World DFA to get to your questions into my queue. I've enabled Super Chat, which means you can get your question to the top of the list, or indeed make a contribution to what we're doing around here. Appreciate all those who support us via Super Chat, Patreon, and PayPal. Makes a huge difference. Thanks for all your support. So this evening, it's going to be a really important conversation about mapping household housing pain. And just by way of context, it's worth highlighting, I think, that the story here, I told it the other day a little bit around households are riding the pain train. And the pain train is a way of me trying to highlight the fact, and in fact, I use Grok here to a little bit of a summary. People are feeling trapped. They're feeling as though they're heading down a particular road. Inflation is very high. Wages in real terms are falling. House prices are falling. And more households are definitely struggling. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, because effectively there's a lot of it out there. And finally, I think the media are beginning to wake up to the consequences of some of those things. So that's what we're going to focus on tonight. But before I get there, I just wanted to bring Robbie in because Robbie's got a very important topic to talk about just briefly. He won't stay with us for the full show, unless he wants to, of course. But the point about this, Robbie, is there's a really important thing happening within the next 36 or so hours relating to, well, our freedom.
Absolutely. So first of all, sorry for interrupting, Cookie Boy. Thanks for inviting me in, Martin. I want to talk about the ASIO Bill number 2 that's been before Parliament all year. Now, this was a bill that was supposed to be waved through in February. It passed the House in February, but just before it got debated in the House, our party got involved in actually revealing to the public what's in this bill. And it's genuinely appalling. But it's indicative of the kind of authoritarian laws that we've become increasingly accustomed to accept, partly because we're actually not, most of the time, we're not really sure what's in these laws. And you have this two-party, uni-party phenomenon where they're both, they sort of gang up to pass these laws. And the general debate is usually shut down. And that's exactly what's happening this week. So this bill is before the Senate. This was supposed to be debated in the Senate in March. It started, and David Pocock and Maria Kovacevic both got to have a say. David Pocock's speech against the bill was exceptional, but the major parties are for it. It's just that they have delayed debating it, And now they're trying to avoid debating it but passing it anyway because we have made their life very difficult. Let's just go through what's in the bill first, Martin, because people need to understand the kind of powers in Australia. So this is a bill that expands ASIO's interrogation powers. ASIO is a secret intelligence agency. It's not a public accountable police force. But 23 years ago, it was given policing powers, which by definition makes it a secret police, and it's these interrogation powers. ASIO can grab anybody they like. You don't have to be a suspect. Anybody they like that they think might have information they want. That can be a person as young as 14, a child, right, a minor. They can detain you for up to 7 days for interrogation. You do not have the right to silence, and you do not have the protection of the courts. And what I mean by that is that they don't need a warrant from a judge to do this. If you don't answer their questions, you can go to jail for 5 years. If you tell anybody that you've been interrogated afterwards, you can go to jail for 5 years. So these are very broad, extreme powers that are frankly incompatible with a genuine democracy, but we're moving further and further away from that. Now, I came on your show, Martin, a few months ago to talk about this ASIO bill, and those kind of discussions worked. The attention that was put on this bill actually shocked the Parliament. One of the things the bill would have done is remove the sunset clause that was on these powers to make them permanent. And thanks to our attention, the government and the opposition decided to compromise on that, and they've kept the sunset clause on. But what the bill actually does is expand ASIO's powers beyond the remit they were originally given them for, which is 23 years ago, they were given these interrogation powers as a counter-terrorism measure, right, to try and stop terrorism attacks. Now, under Albanese, they are being allowed to use these powers for everything they do. These will be routine powers for use by a secret police. Yet it was Albanese 23 years ago when these powers were first legislated, who was in opposition, who actually gave a speech in which he quoted Hermann Goering, Hitler's Reichsmarshal, and compared these powers to the Nazis. The fact that he, 23 years later, is the guy pushing to expand these powers shows you how far we've gone down this authoritarian path. So the news that broke today, and David Shoebridge's office brought my attention to this, is that the government and opposition have done a dirty deal to guillotine the debate on these on Thursday, at midday on Thursday. And so instead of having a proper debate, they're going to limit the debate to an hour and then push it to a vote in which the outcome is certain anyway, because the government and opposition have agreed. Now, someone asked me today, well, isn't an hour a long time to debate? Well, let me contrast it to what happened the first time. Back in 2002, when these powers were first put up, it took the Parliament 15 months of fierce debate to pass them. And that debate included, on the last sitting day of 2002, the Parliament debated these ASIO powers all day, and they had a record sitting that lasted 27 hours, from 9 o'clock in the morning until midday the next day. That was the last sitting day of the year, that year in 2002, because of these ASIO powers, because they were so shocked at the kinds of powers that they were being expected to pass. Simon Crean, in that debate on that day, accused John Howard of trying to establish a police state. The Liberal Party's own chairman of the committee that assessed these powers said they had the potential to undermine democracy. I'm telling you, 23 years later, democracy is undermined. And now the major parties are so much in the tank of agencies like ASIO. They are. Has anyone here heard the Liberals object to the fact that Anthony Albanese and Tony Burke have denied a visa to the ASIO agent who said he informed ASIO of the Bondi shooters before the attack? Right? He gave the explosive testimony on Four Corners back in February. He's supposed to testify before the Bondi Royal Commission. Albanese and Burke have denied him a visa to come and testify because they're protecting ASIO. But have you heard the opposition complaining about this? No, because both major parties are part of this apparatus. They have well and truly undermined democracy. However, there is 36 hours to give them a black eye. So what I'm calling on people to do who are concerned about this, hit the phones and email tonight, phones tomorrow, You go to aph.gov.au/senators and members, and you can get the names of your senators in your state, go after all the coalition and Labor ones, and just blast them for passing this, right? Saying this is unacceptable in a democracy to have these kinds of powers. Now, I just want to, before I end, Martin, I just want to address one thing briefly. So people will say, well, terrorism is real. What sort of powers should we have to deal with terrorism? Understand the difference between a secret intelligence agency and your proper police force, right? If you're going to have powers like this, give them to your police force. They are accountable. They are subject to the rule of law. There's a whole murky area when you have intelligence agencies get involved, especially intelligence agency like ASIO, that if you know its history, is actually more accountable to its foreign partners than it is to anyone in Australia. No one in Parliament, well, there's one guy in Parliament, sorry, two guys in Parliament would actually dare to question ASIO. One of them is David Shoebridge in the Senate, who's a gun, and he's also a barrister, and he's not intimidated by questioning, and he goes right after them. The other guy in the House is Andrew Wilkie, right? A true intelligence expert. He's not allowed anywhere near the ASIO committee to question ASIO. This is a closed shop. The major party people say, yes, sir, no, sir, 3 bags full, sir. And when you give a secret intelligence agency that kind of influence and power in a democracy where it's essentially above democratic accountability, you are well down the path to authoritarianism. And there's a good reason Anthony Albanese quoted Hermann Goering and likened him to the Nazis. So if he's not going to stick to his principles, we should get on that website, find the number and emails of your Labor and coalition senators in your state, and just hammer them for the next 36 hours. And let's see. Now, they might push this through anyway because they're like that. Or we might actually force something, Martin, a bit. Remember the cash issue earlier in the year where we did something similar in about a 24-hour time frame, and we put them under so much pressure, the Liberals folded and were going to make the right decision on cash, and they would have that night, except Labor filibustered. And a week later, they got the Liberals back where they wanted, and Labor voted with the government. Sorry, the Liberals voted with the government and the banks. But it just shows you the kind of intense pressure we're able to organise had an impact. Let's see if we can do something like that. Make those calls, send those emails, because this is the kind of stuff that the public have to say to the government, because they're not going to hold themselves to account. You are accountable to us. Don't pass these kinds of laws.
Yeah, games people play, Robbie, eh? And
Yep.
of course, when it's got security attached to it and risk attached to it, somehow the politicians just get weak at the knees and don't want to do anything. This is a critical thing for our future security, safety, and freedom, because effectively freedom is on the table here, and freedom will be taken away if this were to be passed as is. So it's really critical, folks. Links and things there, and it's actually here as well. You can see there the link to go to find the senators and members' details. And
I stood in front of the corner tower of Pentridge Prison, which is off the road, over the road from our office, Martin, to show you the entry to the dungeon, which is how we used to treat people a long time ago before we developed these kinds of democratic norms and a sense of rights. And we've undermined all that with where we're going with these kinds of powers in recent times.
Absolutely. And I've said so many occasions, we continue to sort of ratchet it down. Freedoms are being taken away. What we once believed to be immutable suddenly is now being whipped away from us. People fought 100%. For generations for those freedoms, and our politicians are just giving them away. It's unacceptable. It needs to stop. Robbie, thank you so much. We're going to clip this.
Just Martin, just to answer one of the question from Jump for Joy that came up.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, if you go to either me on X at Robbie Barwick or at Citizens Party AU on X, you will see the statement that we put out today. You can grab that and share it everywhere, please.
Yeah, let's make a social media fuss as well. Robbie, thank you very much.
Thanks, Martin.
Cookie says, true warrior commie, love your passion. So well done. And thank you very much. I'll take you offline, and I'll go back to my normal show. Guys. See you later.
Yep. See you.
Well, I thought that was worth just focusing on for a little while, because this is such a critical issue. And thanks for bearing with me as we did that. Let's get back now to the show that I intended to run this evening. And that is very much focusing on this broader question of what is the economic context for what's going on at the moment and the pain train and how that's going on. And a way into that is just to look at some of the recent information. For example, the Consumer Sentiment Index from Westpac was just a little stronger, but they made the point that the results are still pessimistic. It's driven by people with mortgages post RBA decision to hold, while renter sentiment fall modestly. Unemployment expectations rise above long-term average, partly reversing last month's fall. House price expectations decline as markets weaken. Renters less likely to expect price falls and more downbeat about home purchases. And it's interesting, another way to look at this, if you look at the Shane Oliver analysis, he actually mapped the two. He makes the point that on consumer sentiment in August, in Australia, I should say, it's interesting to note that the bounce in August mostly came from those with a mortgage. Males were more confident than females, and by more than would normally be the case. The alternative ANZ Roy Morgan consumer sentiment survey is far weaker. So there's something going on here. And in fact, if you want to take that a bit further, and Cookie Boy, thanks very much for all of the slides and things you've been sharing with us. This is a really interesting article from Shane. Australia has spent decades treating rising house prices as a sign of economic strength. Now the prices are falling. We're discovering just how much confidence, consumption, and borrowing have been tied to ever-increasing property values. And the conditions, of course, do vary across the states, but house prices are a major component of household wealth, and changes in wealth influence behavior. Multiply that across hundreds of thousands of households, and the impact, of course, reaches retailers, restaurants, tradespersons, car dealers, furniture, and other people too. And there's a less obvious role for property as collateral too. And it's interesting that for young Australians trying to save a deposit, reality is very different. It's rising rents, higher borrowing costs, affordability problem. All of those things are very important. And just another angle on that, if you look at JP Hi-Fi. So they actually reported sales growth in the immediate last month or so, really off. They're sheeting it to memory prices, but I think it's also a sign of broader lack of confidence in the market, and very much about this wealth problem and this idea of wealth impacts and the consequences. I'm seeing that in my surveys, as I'll get onto in just a second. Households are really caught. Not all households, again. There are some doing quite well, and this K-shape idea, some doing quite well, and some still enjoying some of the momentum around home prices, but many other people not, is actually part of the problem. But there's a broader perspective as well we need to get into as on the way in here, because, of course, the rates around the world, the yield on the 30-year Treasury, for example, is now above 5.3%. Peter Schiff, of course, made the point the national debt has risen significantly, up 39.9 trillion in the US, and it's very, very significant. And if you look more broadly, you can see that it's not just in the US, it's actually elsewhere as well. So the yield on the long bond in the UK and Japan are also rising, and the Australian 30-year is up too. So we have a financial situation where the cost of money is going through the roof. Part of that is because of the high deficits that governments around the world are running. Part of it is also the fact that there's huge demand now for funding for AI. And whilst initially those AI fund sources were from the profits of some of the big players, they're running out of free cash, and so they're having to borrow too. So there's a huge upswing in demand from the corporate sector for finance, and that's putting significant pressure on bond yields. Higher bond yields translates to much more likelihood of interest rates going higher rather than not more generally. And of course, now people are beginning to think that, well, maybe interest rates will rise. Oh, and the money supply, this is the US money supply, just to show you how much it's gone up. It's pretty significant. And the other angle on this, of course, is the Homis situation in the Middle East. It's not going anywhere. The sort of quasi-agreement has faded completely. And we are going to see this continuing to go on for a lot longer. Strategic reserves all over the place are actually now dropping. And this is the US Strategic Petroleum Reserve, down as low as it's been for a long, long time. We can't go on like this. Eventually, we're going to run out. We're running on empty. And of course, there's now talk about potentially, possibly rationing. Look at the price of diesel, very high at the moment. And of course, in Australia, we're very reliant on diesel supplies. So there is a broader economic context as well as the specific housing context that we're going to touch on further tonight. But I just wanted to put all the pieces of the puzzle together, because anybody who is actually of the view that we're going to see significant rate cuts in the short term, and there are still some out there, I think are missing the point, right? This is actually a much broader, significant risk. And look, there's a risk that the crash, if it comes, could be serious, as we see here from this little comment. And yeah, Cookie sent me a lot of slides. It could well be a 3-hour show tonight. No, I hope it won't go that long. But Cookie, thank you for all your support in terms of sending some of this information through, because it is actually, a very serious situation. And yeah, Iran has the Joker card. They can play this for a lot longer than the US can. And of course, the US are running out of strategic missiles and all sorts of things going on. And Mary, thank you very much for just your acknowledgement too of what we've done. Appreciate that. Thank you very much. Makes a big difference. Nice to know that we're actually hitting the right buttons in some of the things we talk about. Now let's move specifically then on to the housing story. And how much are prices falling? Well, of course, this is the totality combined capitals declines. And basically you can see there that the 24-25 decline is relatively muted, although it's a little bit quicker than some of them previously. But the question is, how far is this going to go? And that is the big question, because of course there are different ways. There are some people saying, well, nothing to see here. It's pretty limited. Well, I would argue that when you actually look at it, you can make it sound not too serious, although the last month or so has been quite serious. But this is the Coolabah Capital Analytics people. Now, this is, of course, Christopher Joy and his merry men. And they annualize the falls, and they're now suggesting that the falls in Sydney are down 16%, Melbourne down 14%, Brisbane down 6%, and Adelaide. So these are some of the things that they're talking about with 2-month annualized, 3-month annualized, and 6-month annualized. It depends how you measure it. But I think this chart from Shane Oliver over at AMP tells the story quite well. You can see there that things are actually definitely taking a turn down, and the momentum is definitely easing. And it's easing not just in Sydney and Melbourne, but more broadly too. And I think we're going to see more of that. And of course, the other angle, we got the home lending statistics, and new home lending fell in the June quarter. Remember, of course, I often say the thing about lending, if lending is expanding, that puts momentum in property prices to the upside. If lending is shrinking and reducing, that takes momentum out of the market and takes momentum out of property prices too. It's one of the strongest levers. I did some modeling some years ago. You can go back and check my show on that, when I showed how significant credit availability is to home prices going up or going down. And the latest, of course, was NAB, who actually produced this piece of information. Yesterday, they released their last 3 months results, and they showed that quarterly home lending applications dropped for investors down 17%, owner-occupiers down 14%. But more importantly, they're forecasting now system credit growth, not just NAB, but in the system, the total system, 2.5% in the financial year 27. Of that, investors down minus 1.4%, owner-occupiers 4.5%. Now, that's a more significant fall than some of the other banks modelled. But it does tell us, I think, that we're in a quite sticky situation. The credit falls will have significant pressures on the banks, but also on home prices. And it's interesting that they talked about the second wave of impacts from housing has been yet to hit. They're talking about the second wave of the prolonged housing weakness, including the lending activity. And this could perhaps pressurize the Albanese government regarding their policies. But of course, on the other hand, the government is saying, nothing to do with us. We didn't do this. Well, maybe not. And analysts are saying that the property pain is likely to spread. And wherever you look, you can see it touching businesses, potentially the economic slowdown. The renters also hit. And yes, how much will the renters be hit is an interesting question. NAB tipped rents to jump 30%, and they argued that that was necessary to cover the hit from the Labour's tax changes. And there was an article here, thanks Cookie, brace for an extra 30% on your rent. Housing Minister Claire O'Neill declared to Parliament on Monday that the Albanese government had brought to an end a system that enabled investors to compete at auctions, but NAB issued a note to clients that said such investors would need a high yield to cover the loss of tax concessions, such as the 50% capital gains tax discount and negative gearing. As a result of that, rates could go up for rents. And the opposition Treasury spokesman Tim Wilson talked about high inflation. It's by design. And as Matt Barry highlighted, well, Albanese refused to rule out the 30% rent rises and signalling runaway inflation. Runaway inflation, guess what that means? That means higher interest rates, and that means more pressure on households. And yeah, the articles have been coming thick and fast. Ready to burst. Is now the time for first home buyers? Probably not. My analysis suggests home buyers are sitting on the sidelines, including first home buyers. Also, of course, there was an article I published previously about home prices, glasses half full. Well, of course, Matt Cohen was talking about the house price opportunity, prices falling, more accessible. Ask New Zealand. They've had prices falling for a long, long time. And interestingly, in New Zealand, if you look at that, you can also see that CPI rents mirrored the fall in migration. So fall in migration leads to falls in rent. Well, we have high migration, so what's that going to do to rents as well? So wherever you look, you can see there's a bit of a story here about long-term pressures on the market. And it is creating huge, huge pressure. Affordability is a real issue. Prices are falling in some areas. Here's an article just highlighting the fact that price falls are not uniformly spread. There are some areas here where traditionally they've fallen and probably will fall again, but also new pain for tenants as well, because it's hitting the renters. And of course, when I look at my stress analysis, it's the rental sector. Rents are going through the roof, as this one highlights. And in some cases, renters are staying put to try and avoid rents. But there's a really interesting question. And of course, the journalists are linking it back to the budget. Rents surge, budget blowback, capital, wherever you look. So it is a very significant issue that's going on here. The rental sector is the first indicator of the pressures, but is also, of course, significantly hitting households too. And in fact, if you checked in the last few weeks, my articles were actually there in a number of guises as I shared some of the stress information. Default danger rises. Families face mortgage stress in Queensland, actually as well in other places too, the address of stress. So there is a lot to understand here with regard to the pressure on households. And what I want to do now is to highlight in a little bit more detail what that pressure looks like, where it is, and what the implications are. Because this is a big deal. This is effectively probably the most significant economic crisis that Australians are going to see in their lifetime. I've spoken about the high bond yields. I've spoken about the oil pressures, and I've spoken about housing. It's all coming together. And of course, real incomes continue to be eroded. Now, let me then just introduce my mortgage analysis for those who may not have seen it before. I use my core market model, and there I use surveys. I roll the survey every month, and we have 52,000 households in our survey at any one time. We slice and dice the data all sorts of different ways to look at different dimensions, and we take the view about where things are going forward as well with our scenarios. I'll talk about the scenarios in a second. And the way to think about it is we take the stress data, the price trajectory data, the buying and selling intentions, the migration data, the economics, and CPI, employment, those things, put it into the core market model, put in the scenarios, and then we can look at it at a postcode level. We can roll it to a region, state, and all Australia level. And that tells us quite a lot about what's going on. And this is a big deal because effectively I've been calling these pressures building for several years now. And I've been suggesting that the government is a bit blind to what's going on. Well, I think it's now coming home to roost. And with falling house prices, I do think things are going to get worse. But one of the critical questions that people ask me is, well, how much worse? Well, I run scenarios to try and answer that question. And, scenarios are not forecasts. They're just ways of exploring different futures. None of them will probably be right, but it does drive the core market model. And I just want to share with you my latest scenarios which are actually plugged into the model. We could run other scenarios, but the first one is what I still call the still tough scenario, which is the best of the three, which is that we don't see any further rate rises, 4.35% until December. We see an easing later. We see migration above average, but we still see first-time buyer momentum. We don't get a recession in Australia, but we see slowing wages growth, but we also get more government handouts. So that's sort of the best of the worst, as it were. The other one, the base case, the hard time scenarios, we see another rate rise later in the year, maybe in September to 4.6%. We hold them from that point. We see the inflation easing in line with RBA expectations. That's the end of 2027 to 2028. Wages rise slower than inflation. We see higher unemployment. We get a recession in Australia and migration falls to around average. And the worst case, the nightmare scenario, if rates were to go even higher, let's say to 4.85% by the end of the year into next year, because inflation continues to step up, unemployment rises, wages growth stalls, we get rate cuts later, but it's too late. Migration drops below average and we get stagflation. Those are the three scenarios. And none of those may turn out to be the case, but it gives you some sensitivities, and I'll show you what that means. So this is for the all-Australian average for July based on our modelling. And in the best case scenario, there's only a very, very small adjustment to house prices over the next 3 years. But if we see something more like the base case, which of course is already more likely to be now what we're going to see, then we can see falls of maybe 13% over 3 years for houses. In the worst case, it drops to about 32% over 3 years, massive falls. And units will tend to follow quite closely, although perhaps fall not quite as much because of the different supply-demand momentum. And just briefly, we can look at other states. Western Australia is an interesting one. There is still a scenario where you might see small rises, but more likely falls. And in fact, the latest information is suggesting that prices are beginning to fall. Down 11% over 3 years is my base case, down 30% my worst case, and units following on somewhat similarly as well. If we look at South Australia, another booming market, there's still a scenario where prices could rise, but I think more likely a fall. The base case is a fall of 9% over 3 years. The worst case, a fall of 28%. And units will tend to follow on somewhat similarly as well. If we look at New South Wales, it's already easing. Even in the best case, further falls, but the base case down 15%, the worst case down 35%, and units following on somewhat similarly. And if we look at Victoria, again, falls are probable, especially in the base case, down 14%, and in the worst case, down 34%, units following on. I'm very interested that a lot of agents are talking up Victoria now as the place to invest because prices have already fallen quite a lot. Well, if they're going to continue to fall, why would you invest now? And Queensland, there is a scenario where there could be slight rises, but more likely falls. The base case 11% down, the worst case down 30%, units following on quite closely. Tasmania, I'm afraid falls are more likely, even in the best case scenario ahead, and 21% base case and 41% worst case, units following on very similarly as well. And if we look at the ACT, small volumes, of course, more falls are likely, even in the best case scenario, down 5%, base case down 20%, worst case down 40%, and units following on. And Northern Territory, there is still, limited supply in Northern Territory, so there's a scenario where we might see some rises, but in the base case, going sideways, in the worst case, more significant falls and units tending to follow on. Now, another way of looking at it is our segments. So young growing families, these are the people who bought recently, and we think that even in the best case scenario, they're going to see price falls on average across the country. In the base case, down 18%, in the worst case, down 38%. No growth for young growing families. Those bought recently, negative equity, certain. And we can talk about the units falling as well. And finally, let me just talk about the multicultural establishment, the first generation Australians, because they're important in the mix too. Remember, these are migrants. Even here, we are expecting price falls among migrants. Even in the best case scenario, the base case, a more significant fall. The worst case, a very significant fall. And yeah, we could well see that units following similarly. So that gives you a bit of a baseline view of where I see things potentially playing out. I'm going to make the point, these are scenarios. This isn't the only scenarios. We could run a bunch of others. And if people have a particular scenario, that the point is sensitivities are showing the range. I can't see how prices can go higher from this point in the current scenarios that I've got at the moment. And as Cookie Boy says, well, maybe rates should be at 4.85% really, because the truth is that inflation is still not under control. And, Michelle Bullock recently admitted as much. So that's why I think we're probably going to see more rate rises than falls. Now, let's then move on to stress and talk about the mortgage stress. You will know, of course, I have a particular definition. It's very important to understand the definition we use. It's cash flow, money in, money out. Other people use different definitions. 30% of income, and I don't know why these days, bearing in mind the average ratio is 40 or more percent, or taxable income, even worse, through to underwriting metrics. Roy Morgan has a different methodology, but they've spoken about rising stress as well. But we define stress in cash flow terms, money in, money out. So if households have more outgoings, I exclude one-off discretionary items like, for example, holidays, then income, we define them as stressed. If they've got a mortgage, they've got mortgage stress. If in fact renting, they've got rental stress. Investors with cash flow pressures have stressed pressures too. So they're stressed investors, and we can look at it as a total financial stress level 2. And we cover rental stress in there as well. Financial stress is the aggregate measure. We measure it at the postcode level, and we can talk about percentage of households and the counts. I believe the count is a better measure because it's really where the big numbers are, where the pain is going to be. I've shown you this chart before. This is the RBA chart from some time ago, which I really love, simply because it makes the point about the fact that the journey of stress from mild to severe is years. It's not just a little bit. It's a long, long time. This is probably 3 to 5 years over this period between mild and severe. So you start with budget pressures. Some will then miss payments, a smaller proportion, hopefully, and there will be potentially insolvencies. Insolvencies come a lot later. And of course, the banks have actually been doing all they can to reduce and hide insolvencies, refinancing, some of the hardship schemes, going interest only, all of those things. So the insolvency pressures, which are rising now, have been quite low. But this is the spectrum, and I measure stress at this mild end. So I'm expecting things to continue to develop and to get worse in the months and years ahead. So if we start there and then say, okay, so what's the story? This is the summary chart for stress to the end of July from the model. And I'm going to talk rental stress first. So rental stress is 74.4% of households. You can see it's sitting around the peaks there. It's slightly down. The reason is that there were some low-paid wage increases that have come through to offset some of the pressures on the rentals, although recently rentals have been rising quite fast. So I do expect rental stress to continue to be high. That means 3/4 of people in the rental sector have cash flow pressures. It's horrendously high, much higher than it used to be. Mortgage stress at 53% is above where it was before COVID, hit at 32.9%, is still very high. The last 3 interest rate rises are coming through, the inflationary pressures are there, and the costs of inflation relating to insurance and other things are also in there too. Oh, and the RBA calculates the debt to income ratio for all Australian households, and it's rising. Now, that's a very deceiving number because, of course, that includes all households, whether they're borrowing or not. The truth is that debt to income ratios are 6, 7, 8 times for many households, especially those who are actually new to the market. So that's a little bit of context for the modeling. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to deep dive into a little bit more to try and understand where some of those pain points are. And we'll look at some of the modeling that I've done to show you specifically which areas of the country are the most impacted by this. Before I do that, I will just make a little bit of an advert, if I may, because I do provide my one-to-one services, producing a lot of requests at the moment. People want to know what's going on down on the ground floor, as it were, rather than these high-level indicators. So this is an individual confidential conversation. I can look at data at a particular suburb or postcode, and we can look at the underlying trends. I can look at the stress data, the price trend data, and also the modeling, and look at where things may go. It's about an hour's conversation via Zoom or phone, and there's a cost involved because there's a lot of work to do. It takes me about a day to 2 days to put all the information together and talk to the real estate agents, etc. So there is a cost involved, payable in advance. And if you're interested, you can go to the DFA blog and you can book. We're booking 3 to 5 weeks ahead. I've got quite a few people in the hopper at the moment, but as always, very happy to have a conversation. So let's now look at the latest data. This is the July data. I've highlighted in yellow where it's gone up from last month, and you can see there that mortgage stress is higher in New South Wales, South Australia, and Victoria compared with last month. You can see that rental stress is up in the ACT and Queensland. Investor stress is up in ACT, New South Wales, and Queensland, and financial stress is up as an aggregate level in the ACT, New South Wales, and Queensland. And just to give you a little bit of a quantum, there's a little more than 10 million households, give or take, in Australia at the moment, depending on how you measure them. Oh, and by the way, a quick sidebar. In the census, multiple households have been covered in one household count in the census. I've got that definitively from a number of people who were in property where they've their own household, but effectively they are being reported as part of the overall household census data. That means that the household story and particularly the pressure on households will be underrepresented in the census. Very important point. So let's now look at the numbers. So you can see there that there are about 2.1 million mortgage stressed households. That's 53%. 2.3 million rental stressed households. 500,000 stressed investors. And just over 5 million households across the country, just over 50.3% of households in financial stress. 50.3%, more than half of households have cash flow pressures. That's as high as I think I've ever seen it. So that's a big deal. Now, another way of looking at the same information is to look at it in terms of our cohorts. And it's quite fascinating when you look for young growing families. Yep, as you'd expect, 93.2% of young growing families with mortgage stress, very, very high. That's first-time buyers. That's people with young families. You can see that the highest rental stress, and on a percentage basis, is among multicultural establishment. They're the first generation Australians coming to Australia. And the stressed investors are also there. Most of those, of course, because they've got more investment properties, exclusive professionals and young affluents, they're the more affluent groups. But if you look at it in numbers terms, the largest cohort with mortgage stress is those on the outskirts of our major towns, the disadvantaged fringe. The largest group cohort in rental stress is actually in mainstream Australia, suburban mainstream households. And that's also true of stressed investors. So your mum and dad investor, 80 to 90,000 of those have pressures on those investment properties. That's why more are selling. And if you look at overall aggregate financial stress across all of the different cohorts and all the different measures, more than 1 million now in the disadvantaged fringe. These are in the areas around the urban areas of our cities. I'll make a point here. One Nation, very popular in some of these disadvantaged fringe areas because they feel as though they've been completely let down by the government systems and processes. So that's the story there. And, this is a real story of pain, and it's going to get, I think, worse rather than not. Now, it's interesting. You've asked a question there, Cookie, about interest-only owned. Yeah, I do have some data on that. It is true that interest-only loans are actually a little bit more predominant where they were. But at the moment, I'm not seeing a huge divergence between the stress levels in the IO loans relative to the ordinary loans. At the moment, that may change. But the debt-to-income ratios tend to be a bit higher on the interest-only ones. And the banks have actually been quite clever, shifting people across so they can continue to pay their mortgages. Remember, if you continue to pay your mortgage, and people will, they cut back on other things, maybe borrow some more, maybe they go buy now, pay later, those sorts of things. The point there is that the interest-only loan patch doesn't solve the problem. It just shifts it down. And of course, ASIC recently in their analysis of some of these hardship schemes said the same. The banks are moving the problem down the timeline. They're not solving the problem. That is, of course, the issue. Okay, so let's have a quick look then at mortgage stress. Here is the mortgage stress summary. Top counts. Liverpool, postcode 2170, is at the top of the list, more than 14,500 households in difficulty. And Roxburgh Park in Victoria, 3064. Then Campbelltown in New South Wales, 2560. Then Toowoomba up in Queensland, 4350. Then Wanneroo in Western Australia, 6065. Then Narre Warren in Victoria. Then Pakenham in Victoria. Those two, of course, more high growth corridors, a lot of homeland packages, a lot of newly purchased property. Then Ballarat, regional Australia, Victoria. Berwick and Harkaway in Victoria. Camden in New South Wales. Cranbourne in Victoria. Riverston in New South Wales. And Merriwa in Western Australia. So those are the top areas of the stress story based on the counts. But there is another way of looking at that same information. And that takes me to my charting. So this is showing you the mortgage stress to the July 2026 period by count. And I've focused in on the postcode 2000 as the starting point here. And you can see that in blue, it's low. And we go through the light blue into the yellows and the oranges and towards the reds. And the reds are the most significantly stressed in terms of number. Remember, I'm using the count here, not percentage. The reason I do this is because the percentage is warped. If you have a very small number in a particular postcode, you might get a high percentage, less significant than a big number. And as we pull out, as we're pulling out here now, you can see that the story is quite clear. There's stress all around the Sydney Basin, to the north and to the south, Lane Cove, Mossman, Ryde, Strathfield, some of the inner west areas, down towards Botany and Bexley and around Bondi, quite high numbers. But if you then were to look more broadly towards the west, you can see Liverpool 2170 in red. Well, that was not surprising. It was right at the top of the list. And as we pull out, we can see this continued story, a lot of yellows, a lot of reds, and a lot of areas where there is significant pressure. And as we pull out further, you can see there to the north and to the south, there's quite a lot of pressure. And as we pull out a little bit further too, Campbelltown pops up and we see the pressures down towards the south too, below Wollongong. So that gives you a bit of a flavour of the story in New South Wales. Now, if we then go to Victoria, postcode 3000, bit of the same story. Again, there are areas close in where it's not so bad, but if you pull out, you can see that the yellows are coming in quite quickly. Kew, for example, Richmond, South Kingsville, Brimbank. And as we pull out further, you can see that the old favourites over the Wyndham 3029, 3030, 3037 are where a lot of the pressure is. And then we go out towards the 3806, 3805, 3810, all the areas we just discussed, and even down towards Frankston as well. And then Ballarat pops in too. So you can see, particularly around the urban fringe and also in regional areas, you have significant pressure there as well. And we can look at Queensland. Queensland, of course, was doing a little better earlier on, but it's definitely degrading because the costs of property rose so fast, income has not kept up. So we've got more pressure, but the density is lower in Brisbane. So we're not seeing quite so many dark reds coming in, but nevertheless, the yellows are there. South Brisbane, for example, 4101, Carina, 4152, Upper Kedron 4055. And as we continue to pull out, we can see that it continues the story. Redland 4161, Ipswich 4305, and so it goes on. So it's not quite as intense in terms of the total number, but you can see that there's a lot of yellow there, and it hits the Gold Coast too. 4208, 4209, and 4207. And we'll look at Perth. Which is starting at the centre of Perth. And again, there is quite a lot of blue close in, but as we pull out, you can see that there are significant pressures to the north, 6060, 6059, 6019, Wembley Downs, for example. And if we go to the south as well, we can see places like Shelley, 6148, and Linwood, 6147, and other areas too, and to the north and to the south. And then we've got those further off like Wanneroo, 6065, 6026, to the north and to the south. So we've got these pressure points, a lot of new properties, of course, a lot of significant first-time buyers, a lot of people paying a lot of money for a lot of property that's perhaps not worth as much as it was. And as you go further south, you can see that down Rockland Way as well, we've got pressure there as well as we go south. And we might do Adelaide just because we can. In Adelaide, the pressures are building as well. There are areas now of significant yellow, like in Campbelltown, 5074, Hectorville, 5073, and a few other areas too, Camden Park, 503. Again, the density is not so great as in the centre of Sydney or Melbourne, but nevertheless, Adelaide, where prices have risen and incomes have not risen that fast, significant pressures. And we might just do Tassie as well, just to complete the picture around Hobart. And the same story, lower density overall, but considerable pressures there, as you can see. And it's worth just reflecting where you see these yellow colours and where you see specifically the red colours and orange colours, those are areas where price falls are much more likely to happen relative to the blue areas. And that's an important point because it makes the point that I say often is that not all property in not all areas are doing the same. So it is worth trying to understand specifically where the pressures are and what the implications of those pressures might be. Okay, now if we take the conversation slightly further forward, and we can then look at the other mortgage issue, which is the risk of default. Now, risk of default is my modelling based on what I think the base case scenario is going to be over the next 12 months, based on historical performance of defaults. So it's not the current state of defaults, is my expectation over the next 12 months. And if we look at that, we can see the default story is pretty interesting. So Cranbourne in Victoria, right up the top there with more than 1,000 risking default. No surprise, it was on the other list too. Roxburgh Park, Victoria. Those two, of course, high growth corridors that I've said. Mandurah in Western Australia, still there. That was from the previous property boom and bust and then boom again. Success in Western Australia, the same story. This takes a long time to work through. Tarnes in Victoria, Derrimont in Victoria, Yatala in Queensland, Armidale in Western Australia, Toowoomba in Queensland, Wanneroo in Western Australia, Clyde in Victoria, Samson in Western Australia, Gosford on the Central Coast, New South Wales, Pacific Pines in Queensland, and Carey Park in Western Australia. So that's the risk default. Now remember, this is the highest count, but it's also worth just looking at the percentages here, 4%, 7%, 5.3%, 5%. These are quite high proportions. And it's interesting if you look at some of the LMI reporting, you'll see that some of those postcodes are actually in the areas where LMI claims are up. So that tells you a little bit about the pressure and the risk of default. Now, why is default happening now? Well, we've had long-term pressures on incomes in real terms. We've had high inflation. We've had the rising interest rates. We've had the significant rise in, for example, insurance costs and other maintenance costs on the property. And real incomes have just not grown fast enough. And remember that some people who bought a mortgage recently are on 2 full-time incomes because the banks changed their assessment criteria to 2 incomes, and they had very large mortgages, and their debt to income ratio is 40 to 45% or even more, in some cases 50%, we see a bit later. So this is a big set of pressures on households at the moment, and time under pressure can ultimately lead to defaults. Now, the good news is there are some people selling and getting out because they've still seen significant price growth. And those are not seen as distressed sales at all. They're just seen as normal sales. So the actual distressed sales story is quite low at the moment. But if these default risks continue to build, I do expect to see more pressured sales, pressured partly by the banks who will say to people, you should sell, rather than formal foreclosures, which of course formal foreclosures can take months and months and months, maybe even years to work through. Whereas in fact, if the bank can persuade somebody to sell and get out and sell at a profit, they've got enough money to clear the bank and perhaps keep a bit themselves. And in fact, I've had a couple of conversations this last week with people who've gone through that process in the last few months, one in Western Sydney and one over in Perth. And the banks basically heavied them and said, you've got to sell because we cannot continue to support your mortgage. They couldn't switch to another mortgage because that's the other thing when people are actually under pressure, when they're in mortgage stress. And if they're risking default, it's hard for them to switch to the cheaper mortgages too. So this becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So with that sort of introduction to the defaults, why don't we look at the default mapping for the same set of data? And to do that, this is the default risk as at July. And here the blue is low counts, the reds are high counts. And you can see around Sydney, well, there are a few areas. I noticed that places like Vaucluse and Mosman is a little higher than you might expect to see. That's because a lot of people, affluent people, are under significant pressure too. And then Waterloo down there, 2017, Randwick, 2031, and 5 Dock, 2046. It's interesting that some of the articles have been suggesting that these are some of the suburbs where we're going to see some of the pressures on prices and pressures on defaults, of course, as well. As we pull out further, we can start to see over towards the west that we actually have a bit more of an issue. More yellows, Liverpool, of course, there, the Hills, Cumberland as well, Blacktown, Camden, and so it goes on. Now, in and around Sydney, yellows, so default risk is quite high, but not excessively high. Let's compare that to, for example, Melbourne. And we immediately see higher risk of default earlier on, more yellows. And that's because they've been at this game longer, prices are falling further, and more pressure. And then we start to see 3029, Wyndham, very hot spot area there with risk of default a lot higher. And to the north, 3064, and to the south around Frankston and Casey. So we see some real hotspots here where defaults are likely to be rising. And interestingly, I was speaking to a mortgage broker the other day working in Melbourne, and he's finding it very hard now to get mortgages in some of these areas where the default risks are already high. So banks are already onto this, and so they're being selective in some of those postcodes. If we look at Queensland, we can see again some yellows, South Brisbane. I surprised no one, bearing in mind the earlier data, 4069, 4152 as well as we pull out. So the counts are not as high as in Melbourne, but nevertheless, the default risks are definitely rising in Queensland. I'm seeing quite a story here of people who moved from, for example, down into Melbourne or bought investment properties up in Queensland and suddenly deciding that it's maybe not a good thing. So default risks are rising quite a lot. And we might just look at Perth. And again, the counts are, enough to be concerning. And as we pull out, there are areas where the default risks, they're in the yellows. So we're talking 300 to 499, enough to put a significant pressure on some areas. And look at this, up the top there, 6065, and down in Coburn, 6163, a more significant risk of default. And some of these earlier defaults are because of the earlier price cycle that we had in Perth. Massive run-ups and then a significant fall and some improvement, but still people under the pump. And I think it's quite important people understand there is a long-term consequence. Look at Mandra down the bottom there. Long-term consequences. This is something which can take years to play out. So that's the story with regard to defaults. Now, the next thing we can look at then is the rental stress. Now, rental stress, of course, is very significant. I showed you nearly 75% of households struggling with rental stress. So this is the latest on the rental stress analysis. And you can see that at the centre of Melbourne, postcode 3000 is right at the top with the 15,000 plus households with rental stress. And then we go to Liverpool in New South Wales, 2170, Toowoomba up in Queensland. And then we go to Southport in Queensland, 4215. Then we go to Campbelltown in New South Wales, 2500, Point Cook and Derrimont, 3030, Westmead in New South Wales. And then we go to Zetland in New South Wales, Tarnett in Victoria, Mount Druitt in New South Wales, Yatala in Queensland, Ipswich in Queensland, Cooma in Queensland, Blacktown in New South Wales, and Highgate Hill in Queensland. And just worth highlighting that these percentages are quite high. In Campbelltown, almost everybody in the rental sector has cash flow pressures of some sort. Not necessarily, massive, but enough to be on the pressurized list. And if we then look at rental stress in our maps, just opening the file. Okay, so this is now the rental stress. And you can see there that the centre of Sydney has a high count, high density, high rise. And as we pull out, the rental stress is pretty high. Places like North Bondi and Bondi Beach, 2026, Waterloo, 2017, Wollstonecraft and Lane Cove, 2065. And so it goes on. And I think it's worth highlighting that some of the most significant rental stress is closer into the centre of Sydney than people might perhaps expect. But of course, it does also pop up elsewhere. Parramatta is always on the list. And then places like South Wentworthville, Pendle Hill, and Liverpool, as you perhaps would expect. And so it goes on, Campbelltown. So there is a bit of a mirroring of what's happening on mortgage stress, but with a bit more of a concentration in and around the centre of Sydney relative to the mortgage stress. And if we then look at Melbourne, centre of Melbourne, significant stress. And as we pull out, we can also see that there's quite a lot there further out as well. And so it goes on. A few hot spots and a few cool spots. Canterbury, 3126 doing pretty well. Then Ardea, 3022 doing pretty well. But there are lots of areas where households are really under the gun. And as we pull out, significant pressures in 3030, 3029, as you perhaps would expect, and as I discussed earlier. And so it goes on up to the north, 3064. And we can see that there are significant pressures there too. And then we might just look at Brisbane, because we can. A lot of pressure close in, 4006, 4101. A lot of rental pressure. course, the rents are very high in some of those areas and continue to rise, so that's going to put more pressure on households here. And investors, of course, are often still underwater, as we'll see in a second. And even down Ipswich Way, a lot of rental stress there, as you perhaps would expect. 4300 as well. Down Logan Way as well to the south, and down the Gold Coast. Again, some pressure there. And we'll just do Perth. Rents in Perth, very high relative to incomes. They've been rising quite fast and will continue to rise, I think. And so there's quite a lot of people in rental stress in and around Perth. As we pull out, we can see that this story continues to the north and to the south. Rental stress is an issue, though it's not quite the density that we saw in some areas of Melbourne and Sydney. So that's a little bit of an angle there. Now, the other thing we can also look at is the stressed investors. So this is the other end of the story, right? So if we looked at the rental stress, what about stressed investors? What are they doing? And where are they? So we can look at that. So stressed investors, and we can see there that the biggest count of people with investment properties under cash flow pressure are in Beaumont Hills in New South Wales, 2155, and then in Hornsby, 2077, Gosford on the Central Coast, 2250, and then Cranbourne in Victoria, Dee Why in New South Wales, Surrey Hills in New South Wales, Wollongong in New South Wales, and then Paradise Point in Queensland, Mandurah in Western Australia, Southport in Queensland, Craignish in Queensland, Westmead in New South Wales, Littleman in Queensland, Ryde in New South Wales, and Parramatta in New South Wales. Now, the point is, these are areas where you will expect to see more properties coming on the market from stressed property investors. And, it's quite an interesting angle. You can look at it different ways. You can look at the highest gross yields. In some areas, it's pretty high, 6.7% up in the Northern Territories. A lot of the Northern Territory places, because there's so little supply, are doing quite well. But you can also look at the lowest gross yield. Now, remember, the gross yield is the comparison between the price of the property and the rental yield. And just a quick sidebar on that. When prices are falling, it means that the capital price of the property is falling while the rents are going up. Now, that increases the gross investment yield. And I've noticed recently a lot of articles claiming significant expansion in gross investment yields because of that. But of course, if you bought previously, then the price that you paid is going to be higher if prices are falling than what you're actually doing. So your own personal gross investment yield may be a little bit different. And when I calculate gross investment yield, I take account of when they purchased rather than the current price to calculate the gross investment yield. I calculate the price that they're locked in at and the income that they're generating currently from the cash flow. Now, of course, the cash flow is net investment yield, and it's worth just looking at that. So the lowest gross investment yields are places in Victoria, some in New South Wales, like Dubbo, for example, as well. But Victoria is definitely under the gum from the lowest gross investment yields, despite price falls, of course. And look at the highest net investment yield. So this is the cash flow. This is the money in versus money out. Money in, meaning the rent paid. Money out, meaning the mortgage payments, the insurance, the management fees, and all of the other costs of managing the investment property, repairs, maintenance, all of those things. And highest net investment yield, 3.3%, up in Caboolture in Queensland and Tennant Creek in the Northern Territory. Lara in Victoria is there as well, and a few other places in Queensland. South Australia is there too, down towards the bottom of the list at 2%, highest net investment yield. Lowest net investment yield? Minus, a significant minus. In some areas of Victoria, we're talking more than 5%. We're losing money on a cash flow basis, more than 5%. That's a big deal. So places like Reservoir, for example, and Romsey, and the New South Wales as well, Dunedin, and then Pine Mountain in Queensland, and Mount Evelyn in Victoria. And so it goes on. Mount George in New South Wales, and in the ACT in Torrens, minus 4.1%. So these net and gross investment yields are pretty important. And I've been speaking for some time about the fact that many property investors have not done the math on their investment property because they're assuming that it's always going to go up and make money. But if capital appreciation isn't, and if rentals are not actually keeping up, despite the fact people are putting rents up, of course, where they can, that's a problem. So we can look at this also by mapping net investment yields. And we'll look at this one now. So this is in and around Sydney. And you can see there that the net investment yields in reds are under minus 3.3%. It grades through to blue, which means it's positive. And so in and around Sydney, there are a few exceptions. Lane Cove is doing a little better, but many places in and around Sydney, on a cash flow basis, they're losing money. Now, many property investors have not done the calculations, and particularly, of course, with some of the changes that are coming through now, it means that they're losing money on a cash flow basis. A few high spots, blue spots, but as we pull out, it's a pretty consistent story in and around Sydney. People are losing money on a cash flow basis on their property investments. And in fact, remember, you can get 6% on term deposit. Just saying. Let's look at Melbourne. It's a bit of a similar story, but it's not necessarily quite as bad. There are a few blue places, but like Windsor, but there are also quite a few red as well. And in some areas, significant red. People are losing money on their net investment yields on their properties. They should calculate it. Many people don't. They're quite surprised when I ask them for all the information and calculate what they're really getting by return. And of course, they can offset the losses against tax, well, at the moment. But of course, the question is that sufficient to make it worthwhile? And if we just then look at Brisbane, some areas are blue in Brisbane, Paddington, for example, not doing so bad. But again, if you look out as we pull further back, there are areas where we are in quite significant negative territory. It's more variable, but places over to the west, Ipswich, for example, classic, losing money. And as we look to the north and to the south, it's a bit of a similar story. The Gold Coast is just about holding its own, maybe. Logan's doing a little better, but it is quite variable. And what about Perth? Well, here's a story. Northbridge not looking good, 6,003. A few others doing better. And Mount Claremont, 6010, not doing well. And a few others, Scarborough, for example. I want to highlight again, even in Perth, even in these buoyant, quote unquote, Perth markets, some property investors are losing on a cash flow basis. Now, if you believe in massive capital gains over time, then maybe you'll hold. But this tells me this change in the weather for investment properties and the lack of lending for investment properties is here to stay. And that means that the government's intervention will probably be even more successful in scaring property investors than they hoped that it might. But the question is, what does that do for everybody else? So that's a little bit of an angle to try and actually help you understand what's been going on with the markets. Now, we might just then look at the overall aggregate financial stress. Remember that the financial stress is the combination of all of those categories of stress. So mortgage stress, rental stress, investor stress, and put it together, we get the financial stress. And the financial stress story is this. The postcode this time with the highest proportion of financial stress at 78%, more than 30,000 households in Liverpool, postcode 2170. Second is Toowoomba, 4350 with 28,000. Campbelltown in New South Wales 2560 with 25,000. Roxburgh Park in Victoria. Delmont 3030 in Victoria. Tarnit in Victoria 3029. Cannons Creek and Cranbourne in Victoria 3977. Ballarat in Victoria. Centre of Melbourne, postcode 3000. Then Ipswich 4305. Mount Druitt in New South Wales 2770. Westmead in New South Wales 2145. Wanneroo in Western Australia 6065. Blacktown in New South Wales 2148. And Belbard Park 4300 in Queensland. So there is the top financial stress. And we can look at that in our final map. We look at financial stress. And we start in the postcode around 2000. Again, blue, low, yellow, and red, high. And you can see that financial stress is sitting St Leonard's, bit of a hotspot, 2065. Waterloo, 2017. Some areas not doing quite so bad. But as we go out west, Liverpool, Blacktown, yep, they're on the list as you'd expect. 2770, Campbelltown 2560. And so there is a lot of pressure over in the west here, but there are pockets elsewhere. If we look in Melbourne, postcode 3000. Centre of Melbourne, yeah, it's a problem. Other areas, somewhat stressed as well. Remember, we're talking thousands and thousands of households with cash flow pressures in these areas. And this is putting a lot of pressure on the broader economy, as you would perhaps expect. As we pull out, we can see that to the west, around Werribee 3030 and Wyndham 3029, to the north, and also to the east, Frankston, Casey. And postcode 3064, right at the top there in red. Now if we then go to postcodes in Brisbane, and again, a bit of a story as we pull out, not quite so high. Postcodes, of course, have lower density relative to others, but 4034 is there into the more hotspot. Ipswich, again, hotspot. And as we go down to the Gold Coast, yep, the Gold Coast is there as well. So there are areas on the Gold Coast where people are actually significantly impacted. And Toowoomba, of course, is right there up the top, 4350. And if we go to Perth, same story, some pressure, some hotspots. It's not quite as bad as some areas, but it's growing. And so if you go to the south and to the north, Wanneroo, for example, and Coburn, and as we go further out, we can see that there are significant pressures in some areas of Perth too. And I'll remind you that financial stress can lead to property price falls and all of those things too. So that's hopefully given you a bit of a flavour of where the distribution of stress is actually at the moment and all the implications. The truth is, of course, that within each postcode, not everybody's caught. Some are, some aren't. But overall, there's a significant impact. And that sort of takes us then to the final sort of observation. And if I go back to my chart here, this is, of course, my postcode level analysis. Now, I'm not going to do a lot of postcodes today because I've painted you a different picture today. But I just want to highlight that in our modeling, when we actually look at this, in our modeling, the fascinating thing is that we can see where the mortgage pain is in terms of percentages. So we have mortgage. So this is my standard postcode, 2500, Wollongong. I know it so well. So we have in this postcode nearly 20,000 households. quarter own outright, more than a quarter are borrowing, and nearly half are renting. And you can see here that we've got those high rental and mortgage stress proportions. We've also got the default. Now, this is a new innovation. I've now got the count of default and the risk of default, what proportion may default over the next 12 months. That's a new thing I've added to the model. And you can also see there that we've got information about the houses and what they're doing. Mostly units, 52% of units here. We've got the gross investment yield, positive 3.3%. Net investment yield is negative 1.4%. And we've got some taxable income information, 92,000 from the taxable income from the ATO and 84,000 from the old census. The new census, of course, won't be out for another year or so. So we're still running off 2021. And that gives a disposal monthly of about $6,000 with 41% going on the mortgage, 2,467. 33%, a third going on the typical rent, 1,993. And of course, on the old 30% rule, both of those would be triggered as stress. So that is the modeling that we have. Now, that modeling is available for every major postcode across the country. And of course, you can subscribe via Patreon to get that information for all of those postcodes. We update it each and every month, and we include those scenarios. And where the stress levels are higher, that leads to the scenarios, the falls being more extreme. So in this particular postcode, even in the best case scenario, we're thinking there will be slides, not major, down 2% over 3 years. The base case, 17%, and the worst case, down 37%. So that's the story about the stress. Now, as with all of these things, we can look at other postcodes too. If there's a particular postcode you'd like me to look at in the last 10 minutes, I'm happy to do that. But we'll perhaps do another show another time when I actually go into the major detail. One of the little facilities I have here is I can generate a random postcode. So let's do that now. This is Alford's Point in Sydney. And here we have 10,500 households. We have 52% borrowing, so this is a high growth corridor, of course. We have 56% in mortgage stress, that's more than 3,600 households. We have 90% in rental stress. We have 49% in financial stress overall. It's mostly houses, a lot of new developments, I suspect, crowded, small plots, all of that stuff. And you can see there that the vacancy rate is relatively low. Gross investment yield is 3.4%. The net investment yield is minus 1.8%. Average taxable, a little bit higher than some others, 111,000 from the ATO, 142,000 from the census. The multi-flag comes up, multiple incomes going on that mortgage. That gives a disposal monthly of around $8,000 a month. And 39.9% go on the mortgage, 3,240, and 36% going on the typical rent at 2,990. And looking at the scenarios, falls. Even in the best case scenario, down 5% over 3 years. The base case down 20% and the worst case down 40%. And Jake, I just saw your request come in, so let me just put it back into my model and I'll put your query in, 2174. That's Emerson Park. And it's worth highlighting here, of course, this is a growth area. This will probably be a little bit understating because of the growth corridor that it is. We'll get that updated when the census comes in. Nevertheless, we can see that there's a very high borrowing, 67% are borrowing, some are renting as well. A lot of mortgage stress, significant rental stress as well, 90% rental stress. Financial stress is very strong. As a result of that, there's a depressive influence on the price trends. Even in the best case scenario, I would be thinking maybe a fall of 10% over the next 3 years or so. Base case, a more significant fall, down 26%, and the worst case, down 45%. Let's hope we don't get that. Default rates, 2.8%, based on my modeling. Mostly houses, 83%. And the gross investment yield is 3.4%. Net investment yield is minus 1.2%. Average taxable, 93,000 from the ATO, 133,000 from the census. A multi-flag comes up. People are paying with multiple incomes. And that means that we've got a disposal monthly around $7,000 to $8,000 with 45% going on the mortgage, 3,360, and 37%, 2,740, going on the typical rent. So prices may have been growing until recently, but it looks to me as though they're likely to slide in the time ahead. Okay, well, I think that is probably a reasonable place to bring this show towards a close. After all, we did have quite a lot to cover, and I think we've covered most of it. And I'd also make the point that we've got the little conversation with Robbie earlier on, which I think is quite an important conversation as well. Just to say that, I'm going to get that back up. There we go. Just to say that there was a very interesting article that I saw some time ago, which I want to just end on. It was this slide here. And it was interesting because it was Mark Jockham, who is an investment strategist, was talking about the fact that for generations, Australians have shared a remarkably consistent blueprint for building wealth. Buy a home, build equity as price rises, and pay down the mortgage. And if you can then leverage, you can buy another property and repeat the process where possible. Now, the question is, it's a strategy that's been reinforced by powerful combinations of tailwinds, including decade-long decline in interest rates, increased borrowing capacity, strong population growth, record migration, persistent housing shortages, restrictive planning systems, and tax settings. Property ownership was rewarded. But have we now reached an inflection point? And he's suggesting maybe it has. Every investment story reaches an inflection point, and there'll be a growing sign, perhaps, that Australia's preference for residential property may be entering one. And below the surface, we see some prosperity in property, but of course it's on paper. And the market's worth about 3 times the amount held in superannuation. But where from here? And he's suggesting that possibly this is now a time to think about alternative investment opportunities. None of this suggests property is no longer an attractive investment, nor does it mean Australians should abandon an asset that will continue to play an important role in household balance sheet. But it does suggest that diversification deserves more prominence in the national conversation. And he goes through some of those other things. Now, it's not just a response to a tax policy. We've got a whole bunch of other issues there as well. And the truth is that maybe owning multiple properties will be harder for the next generation than for this generation. Now, the point I want to make about this article is that I think it says something very important. We are at a significant inflection point. We don't know how long property prices will continue to fall. We don't know how serious the mortgage stress will be, or we've seen quite a lot of evidence tonight to suggest in some areas it's pretty significant. But what it does begs the question of is, well, if you're thinking about investing in investment strategies, just simply grabbing a property at any price and saying, it's always going to go up, is no longer going to work. The truth is that we are going to actually see significant pressure on households. We're going to see probably more households risking default. We're going to see more households losing paper wealth. And as we discussed at the top of the show, that puts a negative spin into the broader economy as well. So worth thinking about in the context of this question of where to invest and what to invest in. Now, if you're investing not as a financial investment, but if you're investing as somewhere to live, somewhere to grow, somewhere to build a family, then maybe you'll have a different lens rather than the investment lens. But if you're doing that, then you need to be very careful and cautious. I discussed with everyone yesterday about what you buy and where you buy. Not all locations are behaving the same way. There are significant risks in some areas. There are less risks elsewhere. So it becomes really important to shift your gaze from these average increments that people keep quoting to the truth at the bottom of the pack, down on the ground, and do the work, which is why my one-to-one may help you if you're interested in a particular area. We can look at that detail. The other thing I want to leave you with by way of a final thought, households under financial pressure do need to sometimes reach for help. Unfortunately, some people reach for the wrong help. They might go and talk to the bank. Well, the bank, of course, is there to protect their own interests, not your interests. They'll probably suggest interest only. They'll extend the life of the loan because all they want you to go on paying for longer, cost you more in interest. Sometimes that can get you out of trouble, but more and more in my conversations, people do that. and then they come back to the same issue they had, cash flow problems, more money going out than coming in. You need to get the right help. And I always recommend consulting the National Debt Helpline, 1-800-007-007. This is the government-backed and funded debt helpline. There are financial counsellors there. They're very busy. They've reported recently they've never had so many calls, including from people who are in full-time work, trying to work out what to do. And they also make this claim, which I think is worth thinking about, that with counselling at work, 74% can avoid legal action, 69% can be more positive about the future, 66% resolve their financial difficulties, 63% improve their mental well-being, 53% avoid bankruptcy, and 45% improve their physical health. And that's the point. This is more than just a financial question. It's a health question. It's a well-being question. It's a family question. So consider that if you need help. And sometimes it's worth talking to them before you go and talk to the bank. The other tool I mentioned is Africa's Statement on Financial Position. It's available from their website, and it gives you a tool to fill out the various information that you need to be able to talk to your financial advisor, talk to somebody else who perhaps could help you, including the debt helpline, or indeed talk to your lender. So that's another little tool. And finally, before I sign off, just to say that I appreciate all of those who support our work via Patreon. Really appreciate that. And if you want to get the latest information on a regular basis, you can subscribe. It's $50 a month plus GST. Go across to Patreon and join. I'll be sending out the full data set in the next few days to all of those on my subscription list. So that's the way of getting information. If you have one postcode that you're interested in and you want to get that one-page summary for that one postcode, you can contact me by the DFA blog and I'll try to help you. Don't put in lots because I don't have time to answer lots of queries, but if you put in one postcode, I can share that with you at a particular point in time. And it's quite interesting, just a couple of little comments there. Snowman says, extend and pretend the peeps been lured into overpriced house markets with the bank system that use adjustable rate. Exactly. It's a real problem. This was by design. This was structural. This was actually designed to try and support the broader economy. It's failing now, which means the broader economy is under the water, potentially. And NASDAQ Trader, you asked for a postcode, which I can just squeeze in, I think, 2259. Let me just put that in the model. Hang on. This is Wyong on the Central Coast. Let me bring that up. There you go. Just for you. Now, this is the latest on it. You can see there that 43% are borrowing. The latest mortgage stress is a third in mortgage stress from those with mortgages, but 91% in rental stress, 45% in financial stress, 90% of houses. Gross investment yield is 3.3, net investment yield is minus 1.4%. Average taxable 85,000 and 79,000 from the two sources there. That gives us a disposal monthly around 43,000. Sorry, disposal monthly of around 5,400 with 43% going on the mortgage at 2,300 and 37.8%, $2,044 going on the rent. And the default rate 3.9%, 423 risking default over the next 12 months. And in terms of the trends, falls down 1.8% best case, down 70% base case, down 36% worst case for houses. And as it's houses, I'll stick on that. So, post Snowman, you've asked for one too. Dear, oh dear. All right, hang on. I'll do you too. And this is the last one. Sorry, folks. I'm now going over time. This is Cambroon in Brisbane and Moreton. 4,000 households, 31% borrowing, 52% earning outright. A lot of mortgage stress, a lot of rental stress in this area, though it's a small number. And you can see there that the overall story of defaults is 2.1% at 26, 92% for houses in this area. Gross investment yields 4.3, but the net investment yield is nothing. So people are losing money, maybe, or not making any. Average taxable 100,000 from the household census 65,000 and disposal monthly around 5,000. 43% going on the mortgage, just over 2,000, and 39% going on the rent. And the scenarios are best case scenario 8% down over 3 years, base case down 23%, and 42% worst case scenario for houses over the next 3 years. So that's it, folks. Well, I hope you found that interesting and informative. And I'll look forward to sharing further information from my modeling in the next few months as we continue to run our analysis. Look out for further articles in the press because people are suddenly quite interested in all of these topics now. Funny. I've been talking about this for a long, long time. I fear that some of those risks that I saw coming is definitely coming. And I suspect that we're going to see more of this ahead. I will just say that if you are interested in following what I do, you can go to my blog as well. And that's also where you can contact me. There's a little contact form down at the bottom of the blog saying contact me. And you can send me a message via the DFA blog, and it's digitalfinanceanalytics.com/blog. Thank you very much. Take care. And before I go, just the doggies, they're here. Yeah, Meteor came back having rounded up the binman, and she's been sleeping there quite happily now. So hopefully she'll be nice and quiet. And just to say that next week, Leith Van Onselen will be back, the economist. He, of course, has been covering this as well. He's very much in the news at the moment as well. So great to have Leith back next week. And check out my recorded shows each day of the week. There will be more coming on this, finance, property, and some of those broader economic issues internationally as well. Thank you for spending time with us this evening. Take care. We'll see you soon. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics signing off. Take care.